Hi, my name is Shlomie. I am a Java developer by day and a budding pen tester at night. The context and the general storyline we're going to run through here came about while I was working on my degree thesis, which involved everyone's favorite subject, parking tickets. Knowing that you probably wouldn't put up your hand if I asked you on prompt, can everyone raise their hand, please? How many of you do not own vehicles? Put down your hand. How many of you have received a parking ticket in the last year, say? Not too bad. How many of you have appealed successfully? Right, okay. That just gives me some context here. So, I don't need to talk in much detail about the general perception people have of what parking tickets are about, what their actual aim is, how much of an effect it has on road congestions and the likes of that. But you do tend to get an indication when even the government has put up a position and it's sort of subtly saying, hold on a second, it might be going a little too far. Parking tickets are the bane of our existence as travelers. And it's one of those things where, from memory myself, last year I broke down and I had to park my motorcycle on the side of the street. I paid for a weekend for the stay, not knowing when I would pick it up. I returned on Sunday and I got a parking ticket for each day because there was a little sign on the landboard somewhere which said that we were doing work on that street. So it's one of those things where I thought I would put some sort of fight back and see what I can do about this. So I built a parking ticket appeal system. This is a snippet of it where I was looking at when people receive parking tickets, how many of them are successfully appealed, what is the ratio, what arguments are they using, if perhaps you have multiple arguments, which one would give you a better chance based on your localization, so where you are, what sympathy the council has perhaps, and I was exploring that data in detail. Now, generally, there is a lot of play people put into appealing their ticket. Some of them can be quite harmless. Some of you may have seen this before. But this isn't always the case. Traffic wardens do tend to face violence in the street. You may have come across it yourself, but they tend to face harassment, physical violence, and the likes. So it isn't always a pretty picture when it comes to interaction with these individuals. Now, so just to give you a background of what I was looking at, and for the purpose of this presentation, I had 100,000 parking tickets for a localized council. In this case, it was Sheffield Council. It's probably the first time I mentioned it in public. I cleansed 40,000 of these for the purpose of this presentation, and I spent many, many hours in Excel trying to make sense because that seemed the most appropriate way. The way this data came about, this was a freedom of information request, so this wasn't any leak of any sorts, but this was legitimately the council have released this data. I cleaned it up, contextualized it so I understand where this data is coming from. So street X, I want to make sure it's in the localized environments in Sheffield rather than picking it up from anywhere across the globe. I worked in it, geocoding it using Bing. That seemed to be the free way of doing it, bringing it back into Google, and I resulted in the following. You have here, as I skip the slide, the user comes to the system, gives me a context. They'll say, I received a parking ticket on day X at this time. I will return to them the officer ID. I then take the officer ID and I start looking at the record and the historical data on this officer, and I can work out and tell you where is the best place you should go to meet this officer again. Now, traditionally, people tend to keep track of their tickets. I've seen quite a few people have sort of a glory wall where they put up all their tickets, or it's a matter of just going through your transactions. So it's not really that challenging to say 2 years ago you received a parking ticket, can you give me that data and I can work out what's happened here. But you can see here a snapshot. This is the actual data cleaned up quite openly there. You've got a ID associated with each ticket. I believe I was going through about 40 officers or so, 40 or 45. if I take just a snapshot, I don't know, I've imagined it's quite clear here, but I've broken them into sets of weeks, and I've looked at a period of over 6 months here. And you can see there is a deviance here and there, but all in all, we're looking at about an hour range for this particular street for this officer in question. So there is a consistent pattern. We know where they will be, at what time, for a consistent period of time. Next step, let's place it on a map. So again, I've taken snippets here of how I was visualizing it, but I started looking at what is the route this officer takes. Perhaps if I can't tell you necessarily precisely where they'll be at one time, I can tell you the region, or I can tell you where I'd have more confidence where they'd be in a later period, because I'm just tracking their movement. And here we have a problem. We know people can exhibit some sort of violence. We're aware of visual anti-groups when it comes to this sort of thing. And then there's simply the thrill of stalking. And, you know, there is no malicious, there's nothing you can charge, but you can have a sort of a truckload of people just following around this officer after one of them gets pretty rowdy at a pub and just decides to, you know, have a nip at it. Before you know it, blogs are created on these officers, memes are born, and it's mayhem. Taking this a step further, what I've created here is I actually have an API for this data set. So it's absolutely trivial to turn this into a working system where I open it up and sort of say, give me an ID and I'll give you everything. Or not even that, just give me a time and a date and I'll give you what you need. Secondly, some of you may have been familiar with freedom of information requests. A lot of times people would put through requests to sort of use it and say, Council X have given us this data, so therefore it does fall under the requirements or the standards, and therefore give it to us. So there is a precedence here where you can sort of say, Sheffield's given it to us, and I can go around all the councils and start bringing in this data. And also, there tends to be a shared architecture as well. So once I build in terms of the technical, consuming this data, I already have a process in place. It can be quite trivial and easy to do. Where does that lead us to? Even if personal identifiable information has been has been held back, contextualizing it, cross-referencing it can give us a lot of interesting information. In fact, I almost saw it as the better way. It's kind of more fun when you don't actually know who the officer is. You're given an ID and you go on sort of a treasure hunt. You're going to figure out who it was who gave you this ticket. And the interesting one here, which I found doing my research, was AOL. So a couple of years ago, AOL released a data set. Now again, this wasn't a leak of any sort. This was deliberately released for researchers to collaborate and work on analyzing this data set. Now, what happened there was you take a set of data points and you sort of say, someone searched for a unique film. How many places are actually, releasing that film at the moment? And you look through their search history, and then they talk about garden tools, and then they talk about hiding transactions from their wife, say. And you can narrow this down and start figuring out who these people are and what they're doing, even though there isn't actually explicit information there. Another example of this was a Harvard professor who picked up 40% of anonymous statistics on DNA and was able to figure out an identity for them. And this leads us to an interesting area in cryptography called differential privacy. Now, I was asked to actually put a visual for this, but I'll hold back on the maths. I couldn't find anything remotely easy on the eyes. But the concept here is actually a simple one. Essentially what it says is, you could be affected by an outcome of a study, but whether you choose to participate or not in this study shouldn't impact the outcome of that study. That sounded a bit of a mouthful, but essentially an example of this would be if I were a smoker, which I'm not, and I was asked to engage in an interview with an insurance company who was doing a policy and review on it, and they're trying to understand relationships and how it impacts your life, etc. Now, it could be as a result of this study, quite likely that insurance premiums would rise, and as a result of me being a smoker, I would be affected by that rise. But whether I chose to participate in that study or not, the effect would still be there, the rise would still happen. And so you're trying to create a context whereby whether I choose or not to engage in this study, the outcome is still the same for the good or for the bad. Now, You may have noticed earlier I used user 972, and there was a reason for that. Because going back to the AOL case, it became so fascinating to people, and the search history, and particularly one user, user 927, had a staggeringly interesting background, so much so that it actually developed into a theatre production called User 927, which was based on the AOL data output. So, if your idea of theoretical production of your user data is not the kind of thing you're after, you probably want to start thinking about when you do release data, which is a positive thing and an interesting way to benefit from it. You might want to be weary and focused on making sure that you're anonymizing it. And luckily for us, there are various tools to help us do so. Cornell have a couple of tools, and there are various other tools on the market, and just using some sort of sensibility check, appreciating can people cross-referencing it, what else is out there, perhaps not now but in the future, and making sure it's future-proof in that sense, which is something people disregard as well. And that leads me to the end, and I just want to, before I end off, thank Dermot, who's actually come in wobbling all the way from Ireland for this talk and was my mentor on this. So thank you very much.